The more you listen, the more you know. This is Good Politics with Dr. Wilson and Adam Whiteman.
And we're back. Something really big is happening around the world right now. We have the coronavirus spreading. I think we can all agree we hope everybody out there stays healthy in America and abroad. But what we're going to focus on today, I think, is how it's affecting our economy.
Right. You know, whenever an epidemic or a pandemic goes around, the usual conversation is about health, safety, support, and medical care. And those conversations are important and they will continue. But there's also this other conversation that's going on. It's how this outbreak is going to affect the economy. But the narrative is turbulence. There's an economic shock, and there's turbulence happening. And to start us off, why don't we play clip number 1?
Federal Reserve cutting interest rates by 50 basis points, making a surprise announcement of a 50 basis point rate cut. The Federal Reserve saying the coronavirus poses an evolving risk to economic activity, though the fundamentals of the U.S. economy remain strong. The statement saying, in light of these risks and in support of achieving its maximum employment and price stability goals, the Fed decided to cut interest rates. Fed say it is monitoring the situation. I think it's been since January 08 or so since you had the rate cut this size, but the Federal Reserve announcing that it is cutting interest rates by 50 basis points to a new target range of 1 to 1.25%.
Wow. In the last piece, we were talking about we would like to have 4% interest rates. That's a sign of a healthy economy. Is this scary? What should we take from this?
Right. So the reason why I wanted to do this show is that I woke up and read this in the news. I'm like, wow, the interest rates are now 1 to 1.25%. And the Fed usually doctors interest rates in baby steps. It's 25 basis points here, 25 basis points there. They move like a turtle. Well, they took a big whack, 50 basis points. You don't normally see them doing that unless there's some kind of emergency. What I want to do here is this. I don't want to pretend like I can tell people everything that's going to happen in the economy. My training is in political economy. I look at indicators and how presidents are doing and how the American political economy historically performs, that kind of thing. I'm not someone who's a hedge fund manager. It's not my job to forecast where things are going to go. But what I do want to do for listeners is just paint the landscape and allow them to see the way that people are thinking about this, show them what it is that they should be watching for. One of the things that we need to ask ourselves is how this virus is going to shock the economy and who it's going to shock. And to hear that, let's play clip number 3.
Why? Because of the big boys. What about the big boys? Were they more stressed than the small retail investor prior to yesterday's bounce?
I think there are certainly signs of it. We saw a forecast, global GDP and U.S. GDP forecasts come down big from a lot of the street shops toward the end of last week. The thing that hasn't come down yet is earnings forecasts. So big growth forecast reductions, not much in terms of earnings forecast reductions, but clearly they're coming next.
Okay, so this is the big boys, the big players want those lower interest rates to stimulate the economy.
What this guy is saying is that the reason why these rates got cut is because large corporate entities, the big players in capitalism, in American capitalism, wanted them cut. And the reason why is they are most likely to be affected by the global economy. You have to understand we're all connected. And if you have these portfolios and they have overseas assets and you're interconnected, your supply chain, maybe you're selling something over here and it's made in China or whatever. So the degree to which a fat cat is interconnected is greater as far as their economic investment than, let's just call it a small cat, okay? And so this guy's thesis is that once these forecasts came in, they saw that global and U.S. GDP forecasts have come down. So think about it. You run some really humongous entity and you see they're always looking at tomorrow. The one thing about me in political economy, I'm looking in the past. I always love year-end data when it comes in so I can look and see what last year was like. These people are looking forward, and they're seeing that the GDP forecasts are coming down, and they fear that the earnings forecasts are going to be next. And so therefore, the elites are what caused the Fed to make this large cut. Now, what I want to do is discuss whether the cut is going to help. To hear that, let's play clip number 7.
Ultimately, what I want is not an interest rate cut. I want a vaccine, right? And the central banks cannot give me a vaccine. What they can give me is a sticking plaster until a vaccine is being provided by some of the pharmaceutical companies out there.
Do you feel 25 basis points in cuts, possibly even 50, and Goldman are calling for another 50 after that in April?
So I'll throw the question back to you, Sri. How is that going to help? How is an interest rate cut going to help the global economy? I mean, is it suddenly going to reconnect all the supply chains? It's not going to do that. And as I said earlier on, is it going to suddenly miraculously come up with a vaccine? It's not going to do that either.
Wow, this is really interesting. So you're saying the rate cuts won't even help. It doesn't directly address the supply chains, the absences in the market.
I think he's probably wrong about one thing. It's true that cutting the interest rate is not going to rebuild the supply chain. But what it will do is it will allow the non-affected part of the economy to overperform. You'd want the least affected part of the economy to be overstimulated. Let me make an interesting analogy. You can think of the economy as being a body, and a body has an immune system. So if part of the body that gets a virus, then you want the immune system to be stimulated. And that's an analogy that we can use here. And so what I'm saying is, I think that the interest rate cut will at least do something. I think he's wrong about that.
Even if it helps to balance stocks, maybe propping up stocks.
The one thing that I want to stress, because I think you make a really good point, is Americans usually suffer from this thing about being isolationist. You know, they see themselves and then they see the world. So a lot of times we're thinking about that we have our own standard or something. And what globalism reminds us of is this is not the case. We're all connected, and if one entity in the chain goes down, it has a shock effect on the other entities. So it's not as simple as a supply chain being disrupted. It's really what these shocks have. In economics, they call it a multiplier effect. To hear that, let's hear Jim Cramer in clip number 2.
Well, I just think that it's great that the Federal Reserve recognizes that there's going to be weakness, but it makes me feel, wow, the weakness must be much more than I thought. And I've been trying to be bullish, but I can't. But this is like, wow, okay, 50 basis points. I guess the claims are going to be bad. I guess that we're going to have a real slowdown here. And I just wish that we had some great doctors and some great drug companies that could solve this. And we can take back and add 50, I don't care. But I'm now nervous. I'm more nervous than I was before. This is about trying to get it so this country doesn't freeze up.
So who is Jim Cramer?
Jim Cramer is a TV personality, and he's the host of Mad Money on CNBC. He's one of these kinds of personalities that always has a buy, things are great, bullish kind of personality. In fact, he's been criticized for that because he was doing that stuff even as the Great Recession was crashing in. He's just a TV personality. That's all that he is. He's got this market show.
When you say buy, he stresses the consumer economy that America
No, the stocks. He's got a stock show.
Gotcha.
He's got a stock market show. The thing is that you should get from this is that the Cramer suffers from this, what I would call this America First kind of bubble. And so he's the last, to some extent, I did not see the effects that this economy was going to have. When I was kind of thinking, the American economy will be fine. Mm-hmm. And then the rate cut came. So I was actually similar to Cramer in that the rate cut is what woke me up.
You took the rate cut as a sign that the Fed does not believe in the future, that thinks the future might be bleak, and they're trying to stoke the fire, so to speak.
I took the rate cut as evidence that there was a fire. They needed the fire department. The fire department, there's a fire upstairs. The fire department comes and they're trying to put it out. Sure evidence that there's a fire is that the Fed got 50 basis point cut, boom, just like that. They don't do that. That's not what the Fed does. You notice that the thing he's saying, there's a couple of things. He's more nervous than before, and he doesn't want the country to freeze up. And there's two concepts here. One is a multiplier. In economics, whenever there's a shock to a system, it has a multiplier effect. Okay, we're all connected, and if one entity goes down, it's going to have. This happened in World War II. Germany couldn't pay its war debt, and that helped bring the banks down into the Great Recession. So I mean, even back then it was happening. Right now we have much more kind of globalism. We're much more interconnected now. He says he doesn't want the country to freeze up. Cramer says that. The analogy is to a choke or asphyxiation. Imagine this analogy. You've got a body and it's pumping blood. You know, the blood needs to circulate. If it doesn't circulate, you've got a problem. And so this is kind of what the analogy is. By the way, on the firefighter analogy, play clip number 8.
This is the paradox of central bank policy. If you move proactively and prevent something from happening down the line, people will say, well, why did you do that? You may have caused panic and made it worse. But if you did nothing and something goes wrong, then people said, well, you saw it coming. Why didn't you do anything? The research suggests and history suggests that trying to be proactive when you see something coming is valuable rather than waiting until after it comes and trying to pick up the pieces.
Okay, so it's more important to just act, even if it lets everybody know that there might be a fire in the building.
That is it exactly. In the past, for example, in the Great Depression, the Fed didn't do anything, and there was no fiscal stimulus coming from Herbert Hoover. These people did nothing. And so they tried to dig out under the Great Depression after the darn building burned to the ground. Whereas what you got now is this concept of if you get the fire out, the building will be fine. But you got to get the fire out. So these people think that you have to get there quickly. And so that's what this is all about. And then the issue is whether it's going to work.
The multiplier effect being downstream, it's going to have greater impacts later on. Is that what the multiplier effect, is that what you mean?
You know, I'm going to stick with the same concept of a fire. Think of what a forest fire is like in terms of what a multiplier is. You have a dynamic escalation, and it just sends a reverberation, a shock. One of the narratives is the Fed is the only bank that had any ammunition. There are banks in Europe and I believe in Japan. They already have rates low. Some of those banks already have zero interest rates. They don't have any bullets. It's only the Federal Reserve that had some bullets, because we had the rates at around 2%, and we were complaining that they really should be 4% in a good economy. So to hear that, let's play clip number 6.
Now that rates are basically, the overnight rate is set at about 1%, it is a range, but that means there's only 4 rate cuts left, right? I mean, before we get to 0. That's not a lot.
4 quarters or 250s.
That's right.
Or 75 and a 25.
And what are...
Man, they can only do it twice more, but these giant leaps, I mean, I don't think they're going to be taking such a dive. I mean,
Well, the point is, with a rate at 1 or 1.25%, there's really nothing much more left to cut. Because if they do another 50 basis points, we're almost down at 0. Okay, I think that's what the point is.
Some of the other economies with 0% interest rates, what does that really mean?
I think when interest rates were higher, bringing them down did have a stimulative effect, but we're not seeing all that much economic activity in Europe coming from 0 rates. It's almost like this tool only has limited use, and it's like you're running out of bullets. What I want to do is focus on what we should be watching, what our listeners should be watching. There's a very simple thing that listeners should be watching for, and I call it the Great Recession indicators, okay? Interest rates...
Are these like the 4 horsemen, if we see these indicators?
No, well, I mean, look, in American consciousness, we went through this Great Recession. And when we went through it, what did we do, Adam? Brought the rates down to 0. What else did we do? We did quantitative easing. What's that? That's when the Fed buys stuff, its balance sheet goes up. What else did we do? We did stimulus and we did bailouts. Okay, so we walked ourselves out of the Great Recession, and we saw the end of the stimulus, the end of the bailouts. We saw interest rates rise to 2%. We thought we saw the end of quantitative easing, which we did, but they're fudging that a little bit and having trouble getting rid of that balance sheet. That was the recovery index. Okay, so now those same set of indices are going to start going in a different direction. So to hear that, let's play clip number 5.
We are all becoming way too preoccupied on the micro. That is, the Fed had to cut rates. Should they have cut rates today? Should they have cut them at the next meeting? At the end of the day, all of this stuff is irrelevant. The bottom line is that monetary policy can't really solve this problem, as everyone has pointed out. And we're going back to 0. So let's just acknowledge that rates are going to move a lot lower, and it's time for the policymakers to be sitting down and designing policies like TALF and TARP, where the government stands ready to provide funding to a lot of companies which are going to find themselves cash flow constrained over the coming months.
This is scary. Well, it seems like the financial apocalypse is going to happen.
I think that is too scary of an assessment. But what am I trying to tell you? Just take a look at these great recession indicators and see what happens. Okay, is there going to be a bailout? Is there going to be a stimulus? Are the rates going to go down to 0? Is the Fed going to start buying stuff again? We've been through that before, and the question is whether we're going to see those indicators again. So just keep watching those 4 things and whether they occur. By the way, the one thing I think this guy said that was sober is he said, look, just get used to it. The rates are going to be 0 for a while. I think that's probably true. But the thing to understand is I don't want to oversell this. I'm going to play a clip here in a moment that has a bit of a more pragmatic assessment about this. But before I get there, I just want to walk us through these Great Recession indicators. I noticed that people are now trying to talk about stimulus. There's some people saying, hey, we need a stimulus program along with this rate cut. And it's so funny to hear that. Play clip number 9.
Should there have been a huge fiscal stimulus package that the president is out there pointing the finger at the Fed?
Right.
Why not have the president say, listen, I'm going to do the Hong Kong thing. We're going to come out with consumer relief and tax relief and business relief. Is there any mumbling that something like that could be coming now.
There have been rumors swirling for days that something might be under consideration to that effect. But what the president has said so far publicly is, A, I want the Fed to cut rates. B, I want Democrats on Capitol Hill to move forward with a payroll tax cut. Those are both things that the White House doesn't have to take the lead on.
So there's a lot to dissect here, but on the president saying stimulus packages into a payroll tax cut.
That's a separate topic we can get into on another show, is the fact that one of the things this president seems to like is a payroll tax cut. That's not what Kudlow likes. You'll notice that Kudlow was like, he's totally against this. These supply-siders don't like...
He wants trickle down.
Right, he wants trickle down. And that shows something interesting about Trump's philosophy. He's not really the same kind of theorist that Kudlow is.
He's not a Reaganomics kind of guy.
No, well,
maybe.
It's a partial, but he's also got this other thing, this populist thing going on. But I just find it interesting that they're talking about a stimulus. Stimulus is what, Adam? It's deficit spending. You already got $1 trillion deficit as a matter of course. So these people just seem to think that they can just do that. The other thing, though, that I want to talk about other than stimulus is there also been some bailout talk. Now, that's probably not going to happen, but when you talk stimulus, you're always going to be talking bailouts. The two go hand in hand. In modern times, they go hand in hand.
And so a bailout, like when the U.S. bailed out a bunch of banks, we were just like, here's just a bunch of money to stay open.
They give them, they either give them loans or they give them interest-free stuff, give them bailouts as long as they try to pay it back and can pay it back.
4 bailouts would be, what, to keep competition, to keep multiple choices in the market, maybe not lose jobs?
The concept of a bailout is as follows. You're actually raising a very good point. I've got a clip here I'm going to play, but I want to set it up. You're raising a very good point. The bailout is where you say to a company, because there's this temporary problem, and we assume it's going to be temporary, we know that you're going to be under tremendous financial strain, and rather than having you go out honestly in the market and borrow, because that's going to increase your corporate debt, which is already high, we're just going to give you this money and you can pay it back, whenever you can, interest-free, as long as you give back the money, like within 10 years or something. We did this to Chrysler, or we did this to GM to keep them afloat. The GM bailout allowed GM to get through a very turbulent time so that they could still exist and survive, whereas otherwise they might have had to go into bankruptcy. Now, to hear why people bring up bailouts when they also talk stimulus, let's hear Kramer again. This is clip number 10. This is very instructive, by the way, this clip.
Well, I just think that what's going to happen here is that we're going to have a lot of businesses that don't have the cash flow, small, medium-sized businesses. If we keep going into the stay-at-home world, I'd rather try to figure out how to help them individually and keep their payrolls. I got 20 people on my payrolls. How am I going to keep them if nobody goes out there?
Should they hold the line?
Was that an actual company of his? If he has 20 employees and he can't pay them if nobody goes out to eat?
Listen, there is a very important piece of information that he just gave you, and he did not explicitly say it. I have to give it to you. He said something, revealed something to you that is so true in business, all right? First of all, he says he's got 20 employees and he can't keep them if no one goes out to eat. I don't know exactly what he's talking about. I assume maybe he owns a restaurant, or maybe he owns a business overseas or something. But here's the point I want to say to you, and it's very, very critical that you understand this point. If you run a business and you have payroll, Adam, you do not borrow money to meet payroll. You don't put payroll on a loan. What you do, if there's not enough demand coming into your restaurant or coming into your business, is you lay labor units off. There's an equilibrium between what's coming in as income and what gets employed. If all of a sudden fewer people show up at the gate, you have only one choice: lessen hours, layoffs. And so you start throwing people out. You don't act like a family, which would say, well, I want to keep my payroll and all my people employed and keep paying them, so I'll just get a loan to do that, even if it's low interest. Business people do not think like that. They can't think like that.
Right.
So that's why these people talk bailout as opposed to loan. They don't want loans. They're like, look, if you want me to be meeting this payroll and temporarily for 6 months, why don't you give me a bailout? So it's a very interesting corporate philosophy that the job situation is totally dependent on what's happening with aggregate demand.
And the effect of those layoffs means that there's less people working, less people that are able to go out and spend more money. It freezes up, it locks up the economy at the lower levels.
Okay, so what is it that we're looking for? Watch the Great Recession indicators, number one. And number two, Adam, watch that employment rate. What's this jobs report going to look like this week? It's comes out every month. Now, I don't want to predict. I'm not in the prediction business. But I don't think this jobs report is going to be all that bad. But let's just watch that and see what happens. And again, have to see if that unemployment rate starts going back up. Remember, we got a presidential election this year. Now, listen, I told you I was going to play one last clip. I don't want to be someone who's contributing to gloom and doom or panic or so forth. So therefore, I want to give a sober analysis. This is a clip, but this guy has a pragmatic assessment. What this guy says is all of this is just going to be short term. This guy basically says, look, this is only something that's going to affect the first half of this year. The second half of the year is going to be a normal economy. So this is a bit more of a pragmatic assessment. Play clip number 4.
The big question for me is, what is this going to do to earnings? I think we all would agree that the best case right now is earnings are flat.
It's a really good point on earnings. I mean, Goldman's at 165. People are hoping we hold 170. What do you think? Thank
I think of the shock basically as a temporary shock. Most of it should happen basically in Q2. I mean, it's a temporary disruption in our view. So Q2 is down, but it's going to focus on whether earnings are going to start growing in Q3. That's really the
issue. And you don't think that really comes into view until, the second half?
He's hoping this is a 4-month, 3 to 6 month endeavor. This isn't permanent. I mean, this might just hurt Q2, and we might just bounce back from it in the following quarter.
The best we can say to our listeners is it's something to watch for. Okay, so what this guy is basically predicting is that earnings are going to be flat, which is no big deal. And he's also predicting that the biggest effect is going to be in Q2 in the second quarter. So we can expect Q2 numbers to be low. That's what he's saying. And then everything's going to be fine after that. And the best thing we could do is just wait and look and see what happens. We know now what to look for. Watch what the interest rate is. Watch whether there's any quantitative easing. Watch whether there's any stimulus or bailout. Watch what the employment indicators look like month to month. And watch what the economic growth looks like through the second quarter. The suggestion is after that, things are going to be more like they were before this.
I love when you say this is what our listeners should look out for, because we're here to let you know how to watch the game. I love that when I leave here, I don't feel like an agenda's been pushed down my throat.
Right.
The Fed is going to be watching this like a hawk. Now we know what indicators that they're going to give off. Mm. That's kind of how we can watch this game, huh?
Yeah, that's it exactly.
Until next week.
Until next week.
Politics without allegiance. You're listening to Good Politics with Dr. Wilson and Adam WIGHTMAN.